Creating a video game that's a hit with fans and critics alike is nigh on impossible, but crafting a sequel that lives up to expectations is more difficult than it is for me to get through a script without mispronouncing something. While yeah, the groundwork has already been completed, the push and pull between innovating and addressing problems, while at the same time being aware of not straying too far from what people enjoyed so much in the first place, can lead to sequels either playing it too safe or tinkering with features that were totally fine in the first place. Consequently, whether it's because of a misjudged creative decision on the studio's part or an obvious mandate which clearly came from a publisher after a focus test in an effort to attract more players, there are some beloved parts of games that were tragically discarded between sequels. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game sequels that pointlessly took away things fans loved. Number 10. Arcade Mode, Street Fighter V. Despite releasing 7 years after the previous installment, Street Fighter V shipped with markedly fewer features than its predecessor. Planned as a live service that would allow Capcom to release a slew of content in the years following the sequel's release, it meant the base version felt incredibly light on content, something which critics and fans alike took aim at. Sure, the core fighting was as solid as ever, but that didn't mean too much when there weren't enough modes to keep it engaging. Especially if you weren't a fan of the title's multiplayer or simply don't enjoy getting your ass handed to you on a regular basis, which, by the way, I totally do not. There wasn't much for offline players to indulge in, as there wasn't even an arcade mode, the conventional tiered single-player mode that comes as standard in most fighting games, never mind a full-blown story. It was eventually added about 2 years later with the release of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, but by then it was too little, too late. Number 9. Looting and Upgrades, Mass Effect 2. Unlike the slight jump between Mass Effect 2 to Mass Effect 3, the difference between BioWare's original RPG and its seminal sequel was gargantuan. From combat to exploration, pretty much every core feature and mechanic was tweaked in some way to make for a more streamlined experience. For the most part, the radical changes did pay off, but in a few areas, scaling back and cutting elements impacted the role-playing element. Customization options in particular took a huge hit. In the original, you were inundated with items every single time you dropped down to a planet's surface. From different kinds of weapons, armor, and ammo, you were goddamn swimming in crap. That was embraced by fans, of course. After all, what the hell is an RPG without a whole load of loot to find and tinker around with? But the inventory system itself made managing this gear difficult. Rather than, focusing on making this feature better in the second game though, BioWare instead decided to torch the whole thing. You could still customize Commander Shepard to an extent, but the amount of options to choose from were about a single percent of those included in the original release. Number 8. Dual Wielding, Halo Reach. Although the original Halo games pioneered the idea of a 2-weapon limit, the earlier titles at least made the limitation feel less restrictive thanks to dual wielding. It might not be the most practical thing in the world, but what's the point in being a badass superhuman space marine if you can't jump around the battlefield with guns in each hand like you're in a goddamn John Woo movie? It made for the kind of ridiculous, over-the-top action that other shooters like Battlefield and Call of Duty were trying to move away from, and it helped make Halo 2 and 3's multiplayer suites so bloody fun. Sadly, though, when it came for Bungie to develop their swan song title in Halo Reach, they dropped the mechanic entirely, and 343 Studios wouldn't pick it back up when returning to Master Chief's journey with the 4th and 5th installments. The reason was probably due to balancing the weapons more fairly for multiplayer, but that meta excuse didn't do too much to explain why the strongest warrior Earth had to offer suddenly couldn't hold a gun in each hand. Number 7. The Timer, Dead Rising 4. Dead Rising 4 is the black sheep of Capcom's zombie franchise. Despite a marketing campaign playing on nostalgia fans had for the original game's protagonist Frank West, the developers totally undermined their own angle by tearing out everything that made it so beloved in the first place, including Frank's original voice actor. The most controversial change was removing the countdown timer, which had acted as the backbone of every release before it. Though Dead Rising has always been a sandbox experience, it differentiated itself with the timer it places on players, establishing a unique rhythm in the balance between total zombie freedom and sticking to a schedule of missions. Without it, Dead Rising 4 became just another open world game lost in a sea of other open world games. The sequel had other problems as well, for sure, but by taking out the timer, the charm and the drive that defined the previous games was lost, and a key part of what made the series so unique went along with it. Number 6. No Knife or Hiding Bodies, Splinter Cell Conviction. While there were a lot of great ideas in Splinter Cell Conviction, which was intended to be something of a soft reboot for the classic stealth franchise in their effort to make the gameplay more streamlined, which is actually a common design philosophy behind many of the games on this list now I come to think about it, Ubisoft ended up reducing the tactical options players had to complete levels. Sam Fisher's knife was one of these casualties, a close quarters weapon that aided ammo conservation and taking out guards silently. Conviction didn't really need a weapon like this. Here, Sam was more of a predator than a ghost, preferring to headshot guards with silent pistols or bash their heads into toilets to take them out. This, alongside the inability to hide the bodies of victims so they couldn't accidentally be stumbled upon by other enemies, made it clear that Ubi's new version of Splinter Cell had an entirely different approach to stealth and wasn't concerned with giving players a bunch of items and gadgets to get through levels undetected. Number 5. Car customization, Need for Speed, Hot Pursuit. Car customization has always been a major part of Need for Speed's appeal. Especially back in the old Underground era, the series embraced the early 2000s obsession with kitted out cars that were mostly made out of neon lights than anything else, allowing fans to go nuts and create the craziest, flashiest, and most garish vehicles their imaginations could come up with. After those releases came and went, and car aesthetics as a whole became less fashionable than raw horsepower and handling, the franchise began to distance itself from its mad customization roots, eventually doing away with these options altogether in 2010's Hot Pursuit. The series had always been a solid racer, but mechanically speaking, other franchises like Forza, Burnout, and Gran Turismo pretty much covered all bases from a pure driving perspective, and without the extensive visual options for players to tinker with, Need for Speed kind of lost a lot of its charm and reason to exist. Number 4. The third-person perspective, Resident Evil 7. With Resident Evil 7, Capcom tried its best to reinvent its premier series. Doubling down on the scares, it was decided that a first-person perspective would make the game more immersive and therefore more terrifying. And that's fine in theory, but the assumption that a third-person view couldn't offer the same level of immersion or tension ignored pretty much all of the series' history. I mean, I like the change, but there's no denying that the franchise terrified players for years from both its fixed angles and over-the-shoulder cameras. The perspective wasn't the problem, it was the developer's own approach to the gameplay. And if that was ever in doubt, the recent Resident Evil 2 proved that a third-person resi can still be absolutely horrifying. In fact, if rumors are to be believed, the remake's success has even caused Capcom to reconsider how they're going to tackle a true sequel to the 7th game, potentially dropping its style completely. Number 3. Distinct ammo types, Dead Space 3. Dead Space 3 was a radical change from the claustrophobic first and second entries in the survival horror franchise. In an attempt to chase a more mainstream, action-orientated crowd, the third title introduced co-op, dropped the dimly lit corridors of space stations for a gleaming, bright snow planet, and threw hordes of monsters at you to the point where whatever fright factor they once held was dissolved in a stream of bullets. What killed all pretense of Dead Space 3 being a proper survival horror game, however, was the change to the ammo types. In prior releases, you were forced to not only think about which gun was necessary for which situation, but which guns you even had enough resources to use. Dead Space 3, though, in order to accommodate the introduction of a crafting bench where weapons could be extensively customized and even combined, made all ammo universal. Not only did this completely tank weapon variety, as you'd end up creating a super all-purpose gun that could solve any problem, but it also destroyed the tension that came from resource management, as you always knew any weapon was viable as long as you had some ammo in your inventory. Number 2. 3 vs 3 fights and no X-Men, Marvel vs Capcom Infinite. For a while, it looked as though Marvel vs. Capcom might have been done for, as the licensing agreement between the two companies came to an end in 2012. Fortunately, the deal was back on a few years later once Disney gave up publishing entirely, and a new game subtitled Infinite was poised to be something of a reinvention of the series, an attempt to draw in a larger mainstream crowd. Yep, where have we heard that before? That meant a few major changes were going to be made, including the decision to drop fights down from 3 vs 3 to 2 vs 2. Rather than the alteration being down to balancing issues or anything like that, the developers admitted that they thought having to choose 3 different fighters was too much for players to deal with, and they didn't want to put them off with too many decisions before a bout had even begun. If anything though, 2v2 only limited gameplay options in the matches themselves, which, alongside the lack of key characters such as the X-Men, no doubt a move on Disney's behalf to promote characters they actually own totally, only put off the die-hard fans rather than drawing in new ones. Number 1. Galactic Conquest, Star Wars Battlefront. Ever since it was announced that EA were bringing Star Wars Battlefront back, fans have been asking one question: Where the hell is Galactic Conquest? The key mode pretty much defined the first 2 entries in the series, tasking 2 teams of players with taking over objectives until one side completes them all and successfully conquers a planet. It was this large, multi-tiered multiplayer mode that made the most of Battlefront's scale, and seemed like a perfect fit for a team like DICE when they took over the reins. Unfortunately, while this mode was their bread and butter in the Battlefield games, it failed to make its way over to their take on Star Wars. Absent completely in their first attempt, the biggest mode there was Walker Assault, which mostly kept the action on the ground. Despite fans continuing to petition for its inclusion, the sequel also shipped without it, rolling a lot of its features into the new Galactic Assault game type. While it was similar, it lacked the meta push of the original and wasn't really a worthy replacement. It's not the main reason Battlefront 1 and 2 failed, but it certainly didn't help win over fans of the older games to EA's new vision. So that's our list. What do you guys think down in the comments below? Did you miss these features as much as I did, or weren't you really bothered about them? Either way, while you're there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, you've been watching WhatCulture, and I'll see you soon. Bye.